tale of American foreign policy starts before the United States was a country, in the year 1700. The continent was split into three major powers, France, Britain, and Spain, who continually bickered and fought in Europe and the Americas for control of land and trade. European conflicts spilled over into the Americas, pitting settlers against settlers in major conflicts. However, this was a two-way street. A small battle between the French and British in the Americas, dubbed the War of Jenkins' Ear, spilled over into a full-on European conflict, the Seven Years' War, also referred to as the French-Indian War. Where previously the colonies had assisted only when they themselves were on the front line, this war created the need for the colonies to pull together and fight with all their strength. Benjamin Franklin was key in bringing the colonies together and negotiating with the British government to allow for more organization and free will in the colonies. The British hesitantly agreed. This skilled compromise gave the colonies breathing room and would be the start to the Revolution. At the end of the 7 Years' War, the French defeated focused their bitterness on the British rather than the colonists. They would later capitalize on this during the Revolution, when the colonies would come to them for help against the British. When the Revolution did come, the Continental Congress not only wanted to fight for the America's freedom, but also an end to colonization and a radical change to international affairs. These ideas would affect the short-term creation of the country, but would be violated as the years passed. Benjamin Franklin, employed as envoy to France in 1776, would also use these ideas when he negotiated support from France and when creating treaties. France pledged full support after the victory in Saratoga, and with their help, the U.S. was able to create itself a shaky, disorganized confederacy. As the U.S. began to emerge as a serious economic contender in power, its first president, George Washington, warned against entangling the U.S. in foreign politics and treaties. He believed the U.S. would do well to separate itself from the bickering of Europe that had costed so many lives and its freedom while they were colonies. In the following years, his advice would be acknowledged but politely ignored when the U.S. was large enough to brush shoulders with the greatest European powers. Fast forward to 1804, when Thomas Jefferson had won his second presidency. In a few decades, the U.S. had gone in the opposite direction that Washington had intended, and was not only torn between two political parties, but in the constant animosity of Britain and France. The Federalists supported friendly relations with Britain, which was conflicted by the Democratic-Republican view of pro-French foreign policy. When a British vessel fired on an American ship for not allowing to conduct a search on board, Jefferson had the option to create another war with Britain. Jefferson was a Democratic-Republican, but understood the nation's faults and weaknesses. It wasn't ready for a war with any nation. He elected to remain neutral in accordance with Washington's ideas, and by creating a harsh embargo on both nations. The embargo was taken back after public backlash, and now the U.S. had lost its nonviolent weapon against Europe. The War of 1812 would erupt a few years later after another incident at sea. It saw Washington burned and America defeated in Canada, but both sides were tired of fighting by the time the Russian Tsar brought them together to sign a treaty that would end the war.
After the War of 1812, the first change in American foreign policy occurred with the creation of the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that the European powers could no longer colonize the Western Hemisphere, and the United States would prevent them militarily. While lacking the power to actually back up the Monroe Doctrine, it represented the expansion of United States foreign policy beyond matters of Britain and France. It also established the United States as a protector of smaller nations in the Americas, as it would use to advance its imperialism later in the century. Throughout the antebellum period, most American foreign policy was focused on westward expansion. A treaty with Britain was negotiated so that both nations could share the Oregon Territory, which was seeing a stream of new pioneers from America. Relations with Mexico were more strained because many land-hungry American settlers were pouring into Texas and California, forcing out the less numerous Mexican rancheros. Eventually, the Americans in Texas formed their own nation, the Republic of Texas, breaking away from Mexico. In 1845, the United States annexed Texas, which Mexico still considered under its control. The resulting Mexican outrage helped launch the Mexican-American War. However, aside from westward expansion, the issue of slavery in the United States caused much of the foreign policy of the antebellum Civil War and Reconstruction periods to be isolationist. During the Civil War, the Confederacy tried to form an alliance with Britain over Britain's dependence on cotton, but losses at Antietam and Gettysburg, combined with abolitionist sympathy in Britain, stopped Britain from coming to the South's aid. After Reconstruction ended with the Compromise of 1877 and the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, America entered into a period of intense industrial growth known as the Gilded Age. While the early portion of the Gilded Age continued the same isolationist foreign policy of earlier eras, the latter part, towards the end of the 19th century, saw the rise of American imperialism. With the closure of the frontier in 1890, the United States sought to expand its frontiers overseas, backed by its new industrial economy. This new imperialist foreign policy led to the dubious Spanish-American War, the annexation of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Sandwich Islands, and the Philippines. In the Progressive Era, foreign policy was imperialist under President Theodore Roosevelt, but later took a turn toward the more modern ideology of moral diplomacy under President Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt, a participant in the Spanish-American War, used force to buy the Panama Canal Project and the surrounding land, allowing it to be completed later in 1914. He added his own corollary to the Monroe Doctrine by beginning a policy of tighter control on the Caribbean nations, limiting their political freedom and forcing them to support American interests in exchange for protection. Under Wilson, the United States took an active role in European politics for the first time. Wilson took the country into World War I in response to unrestricted U-boat warfare and threats from Mexico, which was perceived to be the enemy nation's sovereignty. The United States joined on the side of the Triple Entente because of existing cultural ties with Britain and France, tipping the war back in the Allies' favor. When negotiating the Treaty of Paris, Wilson advocated national self-determination, forgiveness for Germany, and the creation of a League of Nations. His far-sighted proposals were largely ignored, both in Europe and at home in the United States, by a resurgence of isolationist sentiment. The United States did not join the League of Nations, and in 1921, Warren G. Harding was sworn in as president with a promise for a return to normalcy and isolationism.
After World War I, American foreign policy took an isolationist approach, based off of George Washington's ideals of isolationism. This isolationist approach was due to American fear of European ideological goals of fascist power. However, in the 1940s, U.S. projects such as the Cash Carry Program and the Lend-Lease Act provided assistance to Allied powers against fascist Germany and Italy. This growing involvement caused the U.S. to move away from isolationist policies and more towards an interventionist policies. This meant that they would practice intervening in sovereign state affairs. After World War II, America was completely interventionist due to the spread of communism. Containment of communism in Europe and Asia was suggested by George Kennan. NATO, or National Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created in order to defend Western European nations from communist influences. Due to tensions between communists and the U.S., the Cold War began. After the conflict in Vietnam, President Nixon practiced détente in order to cease Cold War tensions. Nixon and Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, led the way with détente, talking about world issues and signing treaties such as SALT I and Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. When President Jimmy Carter came into power, he began ushering in a human rights component of détente. He did this by criticizing the USSR's poor record of human rights. The USSR countered by criticizing the U.S.'s human rights record and for intervening with USSR domestic affairs. During the Carter administration, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe created the Helsinki Accords. These accords were made to address human rights in the USSR. Also during the Carter administration, the Iran hostage situation occurred. 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days after a group of Islamist students and militants supporting the Iranian Revolution took over the American embassy in Tehran. President Carter called the hostages victims of terrorism and anarchy, adding that the United States will not yield to blackmail. This caused the Carter administration to become disliked by the American people. Détente ended in the 1980s with the Soviet influence in Afghanistan, the United States boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympic Games, and Reagan's election. After the end of the Cold War, the U.S. became the sole leader of world affairs. Also, the Cold War set the standard for the military-industrial complex used today. The New World Order, as theorized by President George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, gave optimism and democratization for some countries. Due to an attack on September 11, 2001 on the World Trade Center by terrorists, the War on Terror began. President George Bush issued 2 operations of the War on Terror, which included Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. These are most associated operations with the War on Terror. Also, George Bush gave the ultimatum to the Taliban government of Afghanistan to turn over Osama bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders or face attack. Eventually, under the Obama administration, Osama bin Laden was executed by U.S. Navy SEALs.